Welcome to my channel, I appreciate you being here. If you're anything like me, you've been watching the Rings of Power on Amazon every week, and I decided that I wanted to make Galadriel's Dagger. This video is going to be an in-depth tutorial from start to finish on how to 3D print Galadriel's Dagger and finish it. I hope you stick around for the whole thing, I'm excited that you're here. Let's jump right in. The first step in making this is going to be getting our file. I'm using this file from Colts 3D. It's not a free file, but it's less than $3 and that is not bad for most STLs online. You can find a link to this file down in the description. This folder comes with 3 separate STL files, one of the entire dagger, and then 2 separate files split with the hilt and the blade separately. If you wanted to print the entire dagger, the one thing I'm going to let you know is that there's this odd cube that's married to that STL. If you don't know how to fix that, you're just going to bring that file into Mesh Mixer. You can then click on the file and click Separate Shells. Then you can simply delete the cube that you don't need and export that as its own STL. And now you can see that when we bring it back into Cura, that file is going to work just fine. For this project, I chose to print the blade on my FDM printer, which is a Creality CR10, and I decided to print the hilt on my Resin printer, an Elegoo Saturn S. I brought the blade into Cura, and I used the lay flat feature to get it to sit the way that I needed it to. This of course allows the print to get good adhesion to the bed. For this particular print, I decided to do a super thin layer height to try to maintain as much of the detail as possible. The way that I set it up, it looks something like this. I have had issues before with tall, skinny prints like this getting knocked off the bed. I added a nice raft at the bottom just to make sure that the nozzle wasn't going to knock it over mid-print. This print itself was pretty simple. It was one overnight print. If all you have is an FDM printer, you can absolutely print both halves on that. But I do have a resin printer, so I decided to take advantage of that and print both pieces at once, the blade on my FDM printer and the hilt on my resin printer. I'm now in Lychee, getting ready to slice up the hilt. I immediately run into a problem. I'm getting this object repair notification. I click Repair 3D Model, but apparently the program didn't like this model and it was unable to fix it. If you have issues with this same model, or you have issues with models in the future, I want to show you a technique you can use to fix this. I've brought the hilt into Mesh Mixer. You can already see some red on the model. If you click Analysis and go up and click Inspector, you're going to notice that it has these little dots with lines that point straight to issues in the model. You can begin clicking some of these to repair them, or you can also click this Auto Repair All. Sometimes this works, but in this case it did not work at all. You can see that much of the surface of our model is gone as Mesh Mixer has attempted to fill in all the holes, but there were just too many, so it ended up making these massive gaps in the model. I'm going to undo the repair that we attempted to make, and with the object selected, I'm going to go to Edit and then click Make Solid. This should close a lot of the gaps that we have. The only problem is that if we do it with its standard settings, we're going to lose a lot of detail. So I'm going to switch Fast to Accurate, and I'm going to start to play with the solid accuracy, the mesh density, and then a little bit as well with the minimum thickness, in the hopes that with certain bumps and curves, that will help make sure that the model doesn't have any walls that are too thin. It takes a few moments and the model disappeared from my view, but once I got it back, I was able to see that the model looked fantastic. It didn't have any issues, and all that original detail was still there. You could always click Analysis and go to the inspector again just to make sure there were no issues. I didn't even bother. One thing I will point out is this is going to create a massive file size. There are ways to reduce the file size of an STL in Mesh Mixer, but I'll save that for a future tutorial. I brought the hilt back into Lychee. It did give me the object repair notification again, but this time there's only one hole and it fixed it just fine. I decided to leave the orientation how it was, and let the base of the hilt build off the build plate this way. Because of that, I didn't have to worry about supports or the rotation or anything like that at all. I just went straight to hollowing out the file. I'm using flat gray resin, so I wanted to make sure and hollow it. I then was able to set up my settings, select my resin, and export it. It gives me this quick render of what each layer is going to look like, and then it's ready to go to my printer. After about 12 hours, both prints were done. The blade simply pulled right off my glass bed. For being FDM, the print quality is pretty good when you bring that layer height down as low as I did. I removed the raft off the bottom of the print, and I had just a little bit of stringing, so I used my lighter to burn those up so they could simply be snipped right off. The post-print cleanup for resin prints is definitely more involved. I have covered it in other videos, so I'm going to be a little bit brief here. This print's different because I didn't use a raft and supports on it, so I had to be very careful when I was using my spatula to remove it from the build plate. Since my spatula is directly connecting with the print, it's very easy to damage the print when you're doing this. Once it was off, I was able to give it a bath in some isopropyl alcohol to clean off all that excess resin. I was now able to do some test fitting and see how these two pieces fit together. You can see that there's a hole in the middle of this print that allows for about a 1-inch long, 1/4-inch in diameter wooden dowel to be inserted to help keep the prints in line and strengthen it a little bit. I left the resin hilt sitting on a paper towel on my desk to allow for any more liquid resin that might be inside to slowly drip out that bottom hole. While the hilt was doing that, I took the blade for its initial sand. I sand the raw print on pretty much every print that I do. I'm using a powered mouse sander, and I believe I have 120 grit on. I hit the blade really well trying to smooth it out as best I can. Eventually I was able to take that print to the sink. Here I used some sanding twigs just to try to work on the layer lines and those details a little bit. And while I'm standing over the sink, rinsing off all that excess sanding dust, I decided to take some 600 grit wet sandpaper just because I had it on me. I find that lightly hitting the print with a little bit of sandpaper while I'm washing it really helps get rid of any of those imperfections that may have been caused while mouse sanding. I bring the resin hilt over to the sink and give one more wash. You can see in this close-up how I'm able to let the stream of water come straight out of the faucet, go down into one of the holes in our print, and all that water rushes right out the bottom hole on the other side. Putting two holes in a print in the same hollowed space is a great way to make sure that any remaining resin that may be trapped inside our print washes out nicely. I set both pieces up on my counter to dry. I even ended up taking the hilt and shooting pressurized air inside to shoot all the water out the other hole. After that, the hilt was ready for its post-cure. I used my wash and cure station from Elegoo. I also felt like on the blade piece, the point came to just a little bit too skinny of a point. The material was weak on the end and it was a little bit bendy. I used my snippers that came with my printer to cut it at an angle and get rid of the weak part on the end. It was now time for the first layer of smoothing on the blade. Usually I use filler primer and Bondo, but lately I've started using some UV resin, the same resin I use on my printer. I believe here I'm using a clear blue resin, but it's not important exactly what kind you use. I'm simply going to put some in a cup, take my brush, and begin to brush it along the blade, attempting to keep the brush strokes down. I can let it sit for a few seconds, and the resin will somewhat self-level. I make sure to get it all in the detail areas really good, but I don't let it be so thick in there that I lose the detail. I can use my UV flashlight to cure the resin that I'm brushing on. This hardens the resin and creates a layer on top of the print that can then be sanded down. Doing this is much faster than Bondo or filler primer, though we will use a little bit of both of those products later on. While I had my resin out, I decided it was a good time to fill those holes on the hilt. Filling the holes in resin prints is actually quite simple. I'm just going to take this little old wooden chopstick, dip it into the resin, and then let that big bowl of resin sit right in the hole and cure it right away with my flashlight. After that, I repeat those steps on all three holes, and now the holes are filled. I then took the blade over to the sink to be wet sanded and washed. This helps remove that tacky layer that may build up with the resin. I ended up deciding to do a layer of Bondo glazing and spot putty on the blade, because I knew that should be a nice flat surface, and there was lots of little ripples and imperfections in it. To do this, I'm simply going to squeeze some out on my finger and rub it along the blade as smoothly as I can. I don't want to let this layer get too thick, because then that Bondo can start to crack as it dries. I ended up going all the way down the blade, then after about 30 minutes it was relatively dry, and there were some areas that I decided to add a bit of a second layer as well. Once that layer was dry, I could sand it. Now this Bondo makes a complete mess when you sand it, so I recommend either doing it outside or trying to wet sand it so that water can contain all the dust. You do not want to breathe in any of the dust from the Bondo. For my wet sand here, I'm just using 600 grit. This Bondo sands very easy. I'm now going to spray a layer of filler primer on the blade. The UV resin layer took us a long way, but I still like adding at least one layer of filler primer before adding any paint. I'm using the Rust-Oleum 2-in-1 filler and sandable. I'm simply going to spray the entire blade and make sure I get good even coverage. After about 30 minutes, I'll flip it over and hit the other side with the filler primer as well. You can definitely do another layer of this if you want to. Just give it enough time to dry in between. It does dry very fast. You can literally sand this like 20 minutes after spraying it. However, the longer you let this filler primer dry, the less it's going to gunk up your sandpaper as you try to sand it. After that, I did notice that the hilt had a little bit of a lip on it where the print was connected to the build plate. I simply use a file just to file down that little lip. For fitting these pieces together, I decided to go ahead and use a 1/4 inch dowel inside. I measured the length of the dowel that I would need, and it ended up being just over an inch. For the hilt side, I did need to sand it a little bit because the hole in the hilt seemed a bit smaller. That could be just because of my resin printer though. After that, I gave the wooden dowel a test fit and I was pretty happy with it. After that, I went to glue the pieces together. I'm using E6000 and CA glue with a sprayable activator. The CA glue with that activator dries extremely quickly and helps hold the pieces in place while the E6000 solidifies over 24 hours. I then wanted to do something to fill the seam between the two pieces. For this, I ended up using some UV resin. I used a very small brush and worked it into the gap between the blade and the hilt. I ended up doing a few layers of this until I was happy, and there were some areas where I let it go on thick and cured it very quickly so that it would stay thicker. After that, I set the Dagger out in the sun just for a little bit to make sure that UV resin was totally cured, and then I took it back to the sink to sand that UV resin just a little bit. And that was my last step for smoothing this thing. Anytime you're painting metallics, you usually want to have a nice, shiny, glossy layer of black underneath as a base coat. There's obviously lots of methods for this, but personally I'm just going to use this Rust-Oleum engine enamel. It goes on extremely glossy right out of the can. I sprayed one side of the blade and decided to give it a full 24 hours before flipping it over and spraying the other side. I have rushed this step before, and that paint does like to stay tacky for a good 12 hours. With my gloss black nice and dry, I set up some reference photos on my computer that I could look at while I was painting. There's so many different methods you could use for metallics. Of course, you could use an airbrush. I don't even have one. You could use metallic acrylic paint like these. There's all sorts of metallic spray cans available, some shinier than others. And there's even the good old rub and buff method. When doing metallics, I usually prefer spray paint, but for a piece like this, that would require a ton of masking to get the gold and the silver in the correct places. So what I'm going to do is start with my silver and gold acrylic paint and begin to apply that to the areas of the hilt and the blade that I know they need to be. I did not do any masking, I was just super careful. I went through with all my silver first, at least on one side of the blade. The acrylic goes on kind of thin, so usually this is going to take 2 or 3 layers. And eventually I had a lot of it done. I switched over to the gold acrylic and followed it up doing the same thing, carefully brushing it on and adding more layers here and there where I needed it. You don't have to worry too much about getting tons of paint in all the little dimples and gaps on this knife, because those are going to end up being black anyway, as you can see in this reference photo here. After lots and lots of going through my brush with all my acrylic paint, and this felt like it took forever, but I did all of this in one evening. The acrylic paint dries so fast, you don't have to wait much time at all for it to dry. I even realized there was a part of the knife that I painted gold when it should have been silver. Luckily, because I was using acrylic paint, I simply took some nail polish remover on a Q-tip and was able to remove all that paint from that area. You can see it all fixed here. Then I was able to go back through with my gold acrylic paint some more, and eventually I had it all covered. Even with just some of the metallic acrylic down, this thing was looking really good. But I felt like even after the 2 or 3 layers on all this that I had applied, you could still really see those brush strokes. To fix that, I did end up deciding to use some rub and buff. I used gold leaf and silver leaf. At first I used my gloved fingertip to rub it on, and then I ended up deciding that a Q-tip would be a lot smarter because I had a lot more control. With rub and buff, you want to be extremely careful where it goes. Any silver that shows up on the gold, it's not coming off. Rub and buff is a wax, and once it goes on, it does not like coming off. I went through first on the entire knife on both sides with the silver, hitting all the areas, and this waxy rub and buff does a super good job of getting in there and making sure that everything's super smooth and shiny and reflective. After I'd done the entire knife in the silver, I went back through with the gold and did the exact same thing. I was being very careful where I put my hands, because even putting a fingertip in the silver and then touching the gold, that would definitely show up as well. Of course, I potentially could have just skipped the acrylic metallics altogether and went straight for the rub and buff. However, there was 2 main advantages of me doing it the way that I did it. First off, the acrylic paint got into a lot of the gaps and areas that the rub and buff just simply isn't going to get into. And the other reason was accident prevention. I made a mistake with the acrylic and was able to fix it. If I'd made a mistake with the rub and buff, it may have been trying to apply glossy black again, and that just would have been a complete nightmare. It may be hard to tell in this video, but the knife is definitely a lot smoother and shinier now that the rub and buff is on, as compared to just the acrylic. After the rub and buff had set on the knife for about 24 hours, I took an old t-shirt and began to buff it. The first part that we did was rubbing it on, now this part's going to be actually buffing it. Buffing it helps clean it up, make sure that it's not going to leave any rub and buff on your hand, and it does help for a shinier finish. There's not a lot of a technique to this, I just simply use an old t-shirt and apply a decent amount of pressure rubbing it on the knife. I was very careful to make sure that I didn't touch any of the gold and silver, just in case any of the silver that came off on the t-shirt accidentally got rubbed into the gold. It wasn't an issue, and I was very careful. Then comparing the knife to the reference photos, I decided that all the deep details needed to have a bit more contrast. To achieve this, I simply used some Mars Black acrylic and a small brush, and I very carefully used that tiny brush to add some Mars Black acrylic paint into all the little ridges and gaps, and any separations between gold and silver as well. My initial plan was to just do a black wash on this and let all that acrylic sit in there, but I decided that I wanted a bit more control, so I did it manually with a brush like this. It took a bit more time, but I am pretty happy with the results. You made it to the end of the video. I really appreciate you sticking around this long. Please hit like on this video as it would really help my channel grow. I hope that you learned something, and if you did, I hope that you subscribe. I've got plenty more tutorials coming. As always, links to pretty much everything I used in this video are down in the description. If you have any questions, please leave a comment. I do read all of them. And with that, enjoy these clips of the finished dagger, and feel free to click on one of the linked videos at the end. Again, thank you for being here. I really appreciate it. I hope to see you in the next one.